Good afternoon, everyone, and can I welcome you to the Ulster Society of Chartered Accountants seminar on reshaping how we work. For those of you who don't know me, I am John Mathers and I'm the convener of the Accountants and Business Subcommittee of the Society. The subcommittee aims to ensure that the Society remains relevant to and supportive for Chartered Accountants working in business. And we aim to do this through a calendar of events and activities aimed at educating and networking. And I suppose networking has been the particular challenge over the last 10 months. However, following a series of successful seminars in 2020, this is the first in a new series that we have planned for the first half of 2021. Our current plans are to have a seminar on the last Thursday of each month through to April, covering topics such as Brexit and logistics, government support programs via Invest NI, and R&D tax incentives. Further detail will come out as we finalise arrangements, and I would encourage you to keep an eye on Society emails and the website for further details. I would love to hear your feedback both on the event this afternoon and other events that we host. You can provide feedback via the request that you will get by email after the event, or indeed you can reach out to me directly. We would also be keen to hear of any suggestions for topics or speakers that you might suggest or would like to hear from. Anyhow, moving on to this afternoon's lunchtime slot, we are delighted to have 360 attendees registered for this afternoon's webinar, which clearly shows the interest in both the topic and the speakers that we have lined up. I am delighted that we have been able to secure Dr. Nicola Millard, an award-winning presenter, writer, and researcher on innovation in customer experience and the future of work. A TED Talk speaker, Nicola regularly presents conference keynotes and has occasional appearances on TV and radio. Nicola is a judge on numerous award panels, including the Institute of Customer Service and the Association of Business Psychology. And in 2019, Nicola was listed as one of the top 10 UK customer experience influencers. When she is not tied up with speeches, conferences, appearances, and judging, Nicola is Principal Innovation Partner for BT. And finally, in her downtime, I am led to believe that Nicola sings with various cabaret, country, jazz, and blues combos. She wasn't aware that I knew this, and is also a bit of a movie and theatre buff. However, don't let that fool you. I am also reliably informed that she is a qualified judo coach. So Nicola is going to present to us on what she calls the days of reshaping how we work. Now, I'm sure, like me, many of you will have attended talks previously on the future of work, but having spoken to Nicola in advance of this afternoon's session, I assure you that this won't be some futuristic discussion around a conceptual and imagined working environment. And I expect that you might just be left wondering if, partly accelerated by COVID, the future of work is upon us now, and the time to adapt and be resilient to that is now as opposed to some time in the future. After we hear from Nicola, we will have Patrick Gallen, People and Change Consulting Partner for Grant Thornton, join Nicola on a Q&A panel. Now, not that Patrick will need much introduction to Society members, but I will introduce Patrick more formally just before he steps onto the virtual Q&A sofa. To make the session as interactive as possible, I would strongly encourage you to take advantage of the expertise that we have on this afternoon and submit questions that you might have via the Q&A function on Zoom. So before passing over to Nicola, the only thing that I should say is to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be made available later. Nicola, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. So I'm Nicola. I'm going to see if I can share some slides, which is only scores 1 point in conferencing bingo, doesn't it? Along with you're on mute. So hopefully you can see my slides. There we go. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola. I did used to be BT's futurologist. That was my official job title. And it's also a very stupid job title because, well, everyone always used to ask me, did I have a crystal ball? And actually, someone very kindly gave me one. I can say that crystal balls don't work. So if I spent my entire day just looking at crystal balls or tea leaves, that would be very boring. My job title is slightly less exotic. So I'm a principal innovation partner with BT. But I have to say my job is definitely not boring. So just to give you a bit of context as to who I am and what I do, BT is a massive investor in research and innovation in the UK. We're just very bad at telling anybody about it. So part of my job is to raise awareness that we do innovation in BT. We've actually given up trying to figure out where we are in the top 10. I think we got as high as 3 in terms of investment at one point. We're definitely in the top 10. Typically the pharmaceuticals normally outrank us on research and innovation, but you'd imagine that they would, to be honest. So yeah, we're a very large investor. I'm actually based in Ipswich in the east of England. So I am normally based in a lovely place called Adastral Park, which obviously I am not at the moment. I'm actually in my kitchen in Ipswich, about 7 miles away from Adastral. But Adastral Park is the hub of our research and innovation organisation. But like most large corporates, we have what we rather exotically call an innovation ecosystem, which spans the globe, to be honest. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today, we've done with Massachusetts Institute of Technology over in Boston. We've slightly closer to home for me anyway, Cambridge University. I will mention some of the stuff we've been doing with Cambridge. We've also worked with the likes of Lancaster, my old university, with a London Business School. We're just currently doing some stuff with London School of Economics. So you're getting the kind of impression, I hope, that I don't do this on my own. And to be honest, those guys are the reason I don't need a crystal ball. But I'm a slightly quirky member of the innovation team. Most people who know me will probably agree, but I'm not exclusively a technologist. You would imagine that we have a lot of technologists in BT because we are a tech company. Now, I like technology, I'm interested in technology, but I'm only half a technologist, and I'm never terribly sure whether it's the top half or the bottom half, but the rest of me, whichever half it is a psychologist. So I keep claiming that I look at the most disruptive part of innovation, which frankly is not the technology, it's us. Actually, future of work is a case in point. I've been studying the future of work for about 10 years now. And as John rightly said at the very beginning, it arrived about a year ago, didn't it? But to be honest, it was, if there was ever a perfect time to be a pandemic, to have a pandemic, probably the past couple of years are probably ideal from a technology perspective, because technology's kind of saved us. We've got cloud, we've got connectivity, we've got video conferencing, all of the things that have enabled us to rapidly lift and shift the ways that we work. But to be honest, we've had that for a few years now, but we haven't shifted the ways that we work. So it took a pandemic to do that, really. It wasn't the technology that did it. So really what I'm going to do today is to cover what have we learned from the pandemic, what's going well, what isn't going so well, what's almost working, which from an innovation perspective is actually one of the more interesting ones. And also, where do we think work is going based on that 10 years worth of research that we've done. Now, oddly enough, all of the trends I've been talking about for about 10 years begin with the letter D. I think we've got up to 10 Ds now. I think we started with 3. I'm not going to talk about all of the Ds today because it would take hours, frankly. I get very enthusiastic. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a whiz through some of the Ds that I think have been largely accelerated by the pandemic. They had started before the pandemic, but have simply been accelerated. And there are a lot of leaders out there at the moment that claim that the pandemic on a digital front has accelerated strategy by 3 to 5 years. I agree with that. And certainly disruption, which is my first D, plays a very big part in that. As I said, we've had to rapidly shift the ways that we work. I keep calling this a global remote working experiment because it's the first time ever we've been able to study at scale remote working. So, I mean, our approach to research is to ask people how they think things are going. And the stats on the screen here are largely the result of some research that we published It was probably about 4 months ago. And we went around the world and we asked leaders, strategic decision makers, IT leaders, how their pandemic was going and what they thought might actually come out of it. And I think largely, you know, as I said, we are lucky. We've had the technology infrastructure in place that we have been able to make incredibly rapid changes. In fact, I think a lot of people have been surprised as to how effective we have been working from home, for example. Now, it doesn't mean it's working entirely, but I think one of the things that we found in terms of people's attitudes to this remote work experiment is that they want it to continue. If we ever get this virus under control, they would quite like to embrace more choices in terms of how, where, and when we work. But to be honest, we did this survey about 1.5 years ago, and they were saying similar things. People do want more flexibility in how, where, and when they work. I think the other thing is that there are some interesting effects that we've also been seeing around remote working. And these effects, again, we'd seen prior to the pandemic with home workers especially. But because the boundaries between our home and the rest of our lives are now, you know, completely blurred, one of the things that we're finding is the average working day is going up. So the stats you can see on the right of the screen actually came from a survey just looking globally at the effects of the pandemic. And they found out that on average, our working day has increased by about 48 minutes. Now, that could be a good or a bad thing. And hopefully some of the other Ds are going to really bottom that out. And I'm going to start actually with the next D to question some of the, if we work longer, are we more productive? Because my second D is digital itself. To be honest, I mean, as I said, I've been working in this space for a long time. I work for the bit of BT that serves corporates around the UK. I must admit, I'm really missing my visits to Northern Ireland. I used to be over very regularly, and particularly Belfast is one of my favourite cities. So I'm very used to coming over and working with corporates and indeed public sector around the UK. And I have to say, before the pandemic, nearly everyone I talked to, including BT itself, had a digital workplace initiative up and running. I think my frustration was that when you asked people what a digital workplace was, you got different answers depending on who you talked to. So I think the most visible part of a digital workplace, frankly, is the collaboration and communication technologies that we have that actually enable digital working. So that's the visible bit, but that isn't a digital workplace. That's just the technology that supports it. So again, stepping back and asking, you know, leaders around the world, what are the priorities that you want to solve? What are the big strategic business strategies that you actually want to solve by changing the ways that you work? So the number one, and that's been a consistent number one over the years of doing the research, is improving productivity, which makes sense because frankly, if we're going to reinvent work, we probably need to reinvent work to be more rather than less productive. So that's the number one. Number two is improve customer experience. Now, we also know that customer experience and employee experience go hand in hand. So there's a bit of both there, and I look at both actually in the research. And then the third one, which has gone up in the stack of priorities, to be honest, I wonder why, is remote working. So enabling people to work anytime, any place and anywhere. But I think, you know, even productivity is an interesting one to just sort of single out here, because digital work to me is reinventing work completely. And in doing that, we probably need to rethink things like productivity. Now, if you look at how we measure productivity, typically those measures were derived in the industrial age. You know, there were factories and we made widgets and we had inputs and we had outputs. And well, most of us, particularly the ones that have very successfully transitioned to a remote working model, largely aren't factory workers. We're knowledge workers. Now, I don't know about you, but I've manufactured very few widgets over the past year. I'm actually very difficult to measure. And I tend to use proxies to measure my productivity. One of those proxies is time. So I measure how long I actually work. Certainly if you could charge for the number of hours you work, of course, as well. But is that really productivity? I'm not sure it is. Other proxies might be presence in the office. So if you assume, you know, when we used to be able to go into offices, oh, you're in an office, you must be working. That's not productivity either. So it's neither proximity nor some of the very traditional time-based measures. I think the problem is when you start to think, what is it? There aren't any easy answers. I'm not going to give you any answers today. I think there are some interesting things going on, particularly in places like New Zealand and Scotland and Iceland, actually, as well, around can you start to look at well-being as a very big driver of productivity? I think there is something there. But again, how do you measure well-being? Another one I like at the moment is a little bit more conceptual, but it's from Michael Schrage at MIT. His suggestion is if you look at knowledge workers typically produce ideas. So how do you look at idea flow around an organization? Now that requires us looking into the data that's in an organization and trying to figure out how people are connecting and collaborating. And actually idea flow isn't too dissimilar to the ways that viruses spread. The trouble is, how do we get to that data? Now, if you look at Microsoft, for example, they have productivity tools. The trouble is, all that does is measure inputs. So it knows how many meetings I've had and it knows who with, but it can't see any of the outcomes of those meetings. So even then, it's only giving us a partial picture of what productivity is. So I would say my first challenge with the digital workplace is it isn't just about technology. It's much, much wider, and we need to rethink an awful lot of things before we get there. And that includes culture as well. Now, I think, technology tends to move very fast. Culture is not as fast moving. And I think the focus now on a lot of the future of work research, particularly with people like Linda Grattan at London Business School, is really around shining a light on what do we need to do in terms of leadership in order to transform from analog to digital leadership. Now, I think there are a few obvious things. Firstly, about trust. So leaders need to trust people because we can't manage by walking around anymore and seeing people. We have to trust that they work, and linked to that is giving people purpose as well. People need to know how they fit. They need to know what they need to do. They need to know what they actually deliver in terms of value to an organization. That's very much part of leadership. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to shift in terms of leaders. There's an awful lot around empathetic leadership going on at the moment. Christine Derry at MIT is talking about this concept of checking up and checking in. So, the digital workplace is quite formal. As I said, it's not about managing by walking around. You have to schedule stuff. But when you do schedule stuff as a leader, you probably also need to check that your people are okay. Because this is a weird time. We're having a pandemic. It's actually, quite frankly, okay to be not okay at the moment. So we need leaders not just to whip people. We need to make sure that they're helping their people to become more productive by making sure they're okay. And as I said, I think leadership does become much harder in a formalized leadership environment. You have to make an effort to actually connect with people. But leaders do need to create purpose. They also need to be able to share stories because, again, if we look at offices, one of the primary functions of an office is around things like brand. We can observe behaviors. So it's a very big way of shaping culture. When we're not in an office, we have to make that culture and those behaviors very evident. And that is around, leaders actually unearthing good behaviors and, to be honest, calling out bad behaviors as well, and making that purpose and brand very visible to people. I would say my biggest anxiety as we come out of this, whenever that is that we are probably going to be going to a hybrid model. I think most people are agreeing that it's not going to be all about working from home. It's not going to be all about working from an office. It's going to be a blend of a number of work styles. The trouble is, you can get horrible hybrids, and we've already had horrible hybrids in the past. One very good example that we've probably all experienced is a meeting that is split between physical space and digital space. And what typically happens is the people in the room forget about the people in digital space because out of sight is out of mind. And that means it's quite a frustrating experience for the people in digital space. Now, during the pandemic, digital's a great leveler. And I think what we've learned is it's been strange, but actually having everyone in little square boxes like celebrity squares has actually been very liberating and very equalizing. So we can see everybody, everyone has a chance to actually contribute to the meeting. So if you step back and go, well, if you've got half the people in a physical space and half the people in digital, what's the best common ground for that meeting? And actually the answer is probably little square boxes on a screen rather than splitting people into physical and digital spaces, which means that our offices are going to take on a slightly different function because inevitably we're looking at a digital first hybrid. And that links me into one of my favorite Ds, to be honest, the death of Dilbert. Now, I'm not going to kill Dilbert because he's very sweet, but I am going to question a whole load of things about the office. And again, to be honest, this had started before the pandemic as well. I'd become geekily obsessed with office spaces and they were transforming because I think we'd figured out, firstly, that offices are not necessarily places where we go to do heads down work. In fact, they can be very distracting places to do heads down work. They were places where we went to communicate, to collaborate, and as I said, create community. Now, collaboration, I think, is an interesting one because, as I said, as soon as you split people, you get horrible hybrids. So my feeling is actually offices are very powerful collaboration tools, but only if everyone is physically there. However, you probably cannot replace offices as builders of community. And again, if you look at step back and go, what's an office for? If you say it's for building community, you get a slightly different design than lots of rows of desks built for capacity. So that's the first thing. Offices are inevitably changing. So we are seeing digital first hybrids already starting to come into, certainly a lot of the thought leadership in the property community is talking about these. But of course, home working isn't going to go away either. I think the cat's kind of out of the bag. The evidence is it works for about 70% of people. It really doesn't for about 30%. And that 30% typically fall into a number of categories. They are younger. Now, younger people typically, and we've done a few interviews over the past few months, they're often in shared houses. I talked to one guy who was living with his parents, and he basically told his parents to shut up all day because he was largely on calls. He also was handling very confidential data. He's very, very inventive, but what he'd done was basically put a sheet over him and his laptop so that his parents couldn't see what was on the screen. Now, is that a sustainable way of working? Is working off your ironing board a sustainable way of working? Probably not. Linked into that is parents, particularly when schools are not functioning, as many of them are not at the moment, struggle a lot more than people without kids. And extroverts are struggling a lot more than introverts. And I have to say, I'm an introvert. I did not think I was going to like home working, but I love it, I have to say. So I think we are probably going to choose at least a few days a week, and it's depending on preference and job. Working from home may well work for quite a lot of us. There is the third space, though, which I've been talking about for a while, although it has really come into the debate again, the co-working space. And the reason it's come back into the debate largely is being driven by the next big crisis that's already on us, to be honest, which is climate change. So there's a lot of discussion as to, should we be commuting for 2 hours into a city in order to maybe sit and email the person opposite us? Or are we going to be a little bit more creative? If we want to get out of the house, is there somewhere within a walk or a cycle ride away where I can work? Now, this was my preferred work style prior to the pandemic. I used to call it my coffice. There's also the poffice as well. I noticed Brewdog Cannerley had also started to offer co-working spaces in their pubs. Not sure I'd be that productive, but yeah, I mean, brilliant idea. What can we turn into co-working spaces? So I think the debate is still there, but I think a lot of this is around choice. How do we choose where, when, and how we personally are productive? And maybe also we need to come to a compromise with our employer. Obviously, things like security come into this discussion. And that's a lot to do. Yes, there's the technology side of it. So don't log into Starbucks without a VPN. Absolutely. But think about what you're doing in those spaces as well. Are you discussing confidential material? At which point you probably don't want to do that necessarily in the middle of a coffee shop. So I think that's not going to go away. We're going to have choices. We're going to have hybrid, and I think it's going to be digital first. But I think it links it nicely into my next D, which is diversity. Now, Diversity has, as I said before, digital is a great leveler. And I think we have seen some really, really big progress in terms of making sure that people with diverse needs can access and work from anywhere. I have a very good friend who lives in Scotland. She's in a wheelchair. So she has reduced mobility. She used to always complain to me that everything exciting seemed to be down in London. And although she can get to London, it's a much more difficult journey for her than maybe it would be for me, because I live quite close for a start. So she's had a brilliant year. She's been able to go to absolutely everything, contribute to absolutely everything, which she wouldn't have done prior to the pandemic. So I think we need a diverse workforce. So we shouldn't be constrained by things like geography. We shouldn't be constrained by disabilities. And certainly in terms of innovation, and bear in mind, I'm in an innovation team, we need diversity in order to innovate, because if everyone looks the same, sounds the same, works in very much the same way, they're probably not going to have the new ideas that we need for innovation to work. The big one from a telecoms perspective is the death of distance. Now, I never thought we could kill distance, to be honest, and I don't think we have entirely, because I think the one thing when you ask people what they are really missing when they're working from home, it is that face-to-face contact. And I think one of the good things that's going to come out of the pandemic is we're really going to value that face-to-face. However, we're probably going to use it a little bit more sparingly. If we talk, I've been talking to some of the people in the travel industry, and they reckon that the holiday industry is going to bounce right back once restrictions are lifted. Business travel, however, might not. And I think we're starting to question whether I once actually flew to Hong Kong for a 30-minute meeting. That's insane. Why would I do that? So I think we are going to start questioning that value for commutes. Now, have we killed distance? Not entirely, but I think we've done a fairly good job. And again, looking at the results and the data coming out of the pandemic, the good news is that actually within our direct teams, team cohesion seems to have gone up generally. So we're talking to our teams more. Certainly we're sending more emails. We're having more meetings. Now, there's good and bad news there. So yes, we're having more meetings. The good news is they are shorter. The bad news is that we tend to get into this situation when we have an impending sense of Zoom every morning, I call it. So the death by meeting days, because what we've done is we've taken the analog concept of a meeting and lifted and shifted it into the digital world and put it in that formalized 30 to 60 minute structure. And as a result, what we do is we end up with days full completely of meetings without necessarily questioning, is a meeting a good and productive way of doing this? So again, if we look at companies prior to the pandemic who are really good at doing things without meeting each other, they are very good at using asynchronous tools. So in other words, yes, email is one of those, not the greatest one, but shared spaces, chats. And what they tend to do is they evolve those ideas, and then at the point at which those ideas have become mature, they have a meeting. So they use meetings relatively sparely. So the good news is that the cohesion in teams is stronger. Maybe we're having too many meetings, but the bad news we're seeing is that outside our direct teams, all of those weaker ties are suffering. Now, there's a lot of talk about serendipity at the moment. I get a bit cross when people say that serendipity can only happen in an office because I'm struggling. Certainly the coffee points is the one that everyone says. I'm struggling to remember the last time I had a meaningful interaction at a coffee point. So yeah, I'm not sure that we can only do serendipitous things in physical spaces. I think we are missing that sort of decompression time, before a meeting and after meetings, when we're just making coffee or eating biscuits with people we're about to have a meeting with. Those informal conversations can be really good. There are some organizations scheduling in a little bit of time before and after meetings just to do that. It does elongate meetings, that's the trouble, but it could be valuable time just to not be driven by an agenda. There are also some quite scary applications being developed out there, one of which I found called Donut, which is, it's an intriguing idea. I call it Tinder for the workplace. So basically what it does is it looks at people's interests and it matches you with somebody with similar interests, and it suggests you have a virtual coffee with them. Now, bearing in mind I'm an introvert, every fibre of my being is screaming, no, I wouldn't like that. And I'm also quite gratified that talking to some extroverts, they had a similar perspective. So it's an intriguing solution. I'm not sure it's the right one, but at least people are trying to think, well, how do I stimulate some of those random conversations that aren't driven by a formal agenda? And of course, the other things we can start to do is to make, those interactions a lot richer. So these are the more traditional things that you would expect to see in a technology innovation space. So using things like virtual reality, augmented reality, and even holographic reality to start to enhance our interactions. The good thing about a lot of these is that they are not necessarily for people that are office or home based. So we're actually pushing a lot of these collaboration tools right into the front line. One of the best examples actually is the one in the center there, which is augmented reality and 5G stuck together. So that's our 5G connected ambulance. What you can see there is a paramedic with an augmented reality headset on and a haptic glove. Now, what we can do there is transmit real-time, high-definition video. So literally, we're seeing through the paramedic's eyes, transmitting that to a remote medic in a hospital. We've also got the haptic glove transmitting touch. So that remote medic can both see and feel exactly what the paramedic is seeing and feeling. Now, the idea there is very much around, well, let's prevent hospital admissions, or at least if there is a hospital admission, we reduce the handover time between the paramedic and the medic. But there are other things we're doing, certainly in virtual reality, which I'm a little bit more cynical about. I don't think I want to be stuck in a headset for hours in a day. Also, I call it vomity reality. I'm not very good with those headsets on. But I think we are exploring some use cases. You can see, of course, Nicola Sturgeon there brandishing a virtual reality headset with our CEO, Philip Janssen. That's some work we're doing with the University of Glasgow on virtual education. We're actually doing a lot up in Scotland on the virtual classroom as well. In Belfast, slightly closer to home to you guys, at Belfast Harbour, we've got a lot of things going on, including the guy in orange there is a crane inspector, also wearing an augmented reality headset. You wouldn't want him in a virtual reality one because he's climbing cranes. He needs to see things around him. So what we can do is give him a virtual checklist and the ability to call upon a remote expert if he wants a second opinion. We have been discussing whether we could maybe put drones into that as well. We haven't yet, but that's a discussion. We've got remote engineers. I think that technology certainly has matured an awful lot around engineers, either interacting with other engineers if they've got really complex problems to solve. We can also use with customers. We've got something that we're using in BT at the moment where we can ask the customer for access to the camera and the light in their smartphone, and then again, what we can do, again, with their permission, is to get them to show us what they've got plugged in terms of their broadband. So it saves us sending an engineer out who just says, yeah, you got the wrong wire plugged in. So a win-win situation for both us and the customer, that one. The guy in the blue we're not doing, but it blew my mind, so I included it. He's actually a miner. Yeah, a miner in China, allegedly working from home, although that looks like a very exotic home to me. But he's doing remote mining, again, using 5G. So we might assume that only white collar work could be done at home. Actually, that might not be the case into the future. And then I mentioned holograms earlier. We are working on something called volumetric video, very much in the lab at the moment. But we are looking at having holograms projected around. Now, I have to say, I'm a geek. I love Star Wars. At some point, I am going to relish in basically appearing in holographic form to my colleagues and saying, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. But I'm sad, so I'm very excited about that prospect. The technology is very clunky at the moment, but, so was video 25 years ago. My final 2Ds, you'll be very relieved to know. This one is another favourite of mine. This is the death of Dolly. That's Dolly Parton. She is not dead. I think she saved the world, didn't she? But But yeah, the 9 to 5 Monday to Friday makes very little sense in a digital world, because that was constructed for the factory again. So why do we do it? So, I mean, there is a wider debate as to whether 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, or indeed that 48-minute extension of the working day, actually makes us more or less productive. The answer is probably less, because as we know, longer working hours tend to exhaust us. And if we get tired, we get less productive and more prone to make mistakes. We've been looking at one aspect of that, the aspect called Techno Stress, which is all about those lovely devices that are always on and always on us. And as Kevin Kelly says, the problem in the future is not connection, it's disconnection. And particularly when we have no boundaries, we're living at work, it is very easy to start working longer and longer hours. So with both Cambridge University and Lancaster University, and you can see the Lancaster work here, we've been exploring various aspects of techno stress. So everything from these devices actually encourage me to multitask. They're throwing things at me continuously. And that's a distraction. I mean, if you're trying to concentrate on reading something or doing some research or even writing something, having lots of distractions is very unproductive. So we need to probably look at single tasking and turning some of those distractions off. Then, of course, we've got technology moving fast, and maybe it's not as intuitive, particularly in an enterprise space, as it should be. So we can't assume digital literacy. We do need to make sure that people are comfortable using the technologies. One of the biggest problems is that pressure to be always on. And I think, again, with new home workers, for some reason, we feel guilty if we make a cup of tea or go to the toilet or walk the dog. We shouldn't feel guilty, because actually taking breaks during a day to stretch, to clear our mind, clear our heads, is probably a very much more productive way of working than sitting continuously at our computers. So we should encourage people to take breaks. The trouble is, we feel the guilt. And with Cambridge University, we did some work that we've just republished, actually. We've done a diet. And we were going to call it the Cambridge diet, but somebody got there before us. But like any good diet, it's a 5-step plan to better communications behaviour. And it's identifying what those key stressors are. They're typically the M and M&Ms. Doesn't quite work, but meetings, managers, and mail. Too many meetings, interfering managers, and too much email. We can do things about that. And if you are interested, I can share the research with you. Then finally, and linked into my last D, we do have the techno insecurity piece. I think there are two things driving this at the moment. We know that the economy is bad, and people are scared that they're going to lose their jobs. And therefore, there is a pressure to be always on, to be demonstrating the immense amount of value that you're delivering to organizations. But there's also the paranoia that started way before the pandemic, with the thing that was supposed to be changing the future of work. And again, I'm betraying my Star Wars geekery here. I've called it the rise of the droid. So this is all about AI and automation. Oddly enough, the hype's gone down on this during the pandemic. It hasn't gone away, though. I think the trouble is, because we had a lot of hype around artificial intelligence, and nobody saw any results. I think there's a bit of cynicism, certainly amongst UK corporates, and the little sort of dial diagram there is actually attitudes to UK decision makers in adopting technology. You will see that AI is quite low. And actually the UK, in terms of adoption of AI, is quite low. And I think the problem is that technologists, and I include myself in that, have not explained what the benefits of AI is, or indeed what the business strategies around that AI solves. And I think we need to be better at doing that. But I think the key that we need to emphasize is it's not about human versus machine, because if you look at what AI is good at doing, actually it's not very intelligent. Hence, I don't like calling it artificial intelligence, because it's not. It's actually augmented intelligence. We're the intelligent bit. And we do very different things to machines. So machines are great where there's lots of data and lots of process and lots of rules. A lot of law actually probably falls into that, maybe a bit of accountancy as well, but machines are good at that stuff. We get bored. We're good at complex stuff, messy stuff, empathy, caring, creativity, innovation. Actually, machines They're starting to get quite good at some of those things, but still we're way better. So it's not about replacing humans, it's about augmenting humans. And yes, there are some skills implications. We might not be training the right skills for the future. But the last thing you want your employees to be, frankly, are robots. The trouble is, of course, machines under the traditional definition of productivity look really, really efficient and effective. We don't. But that does not mean that we don't add value. And taking it right back to the very beginning, that's why we probably need to really rethink some of the fundamentals in the digital workplace, like how do we measure it? So those were some of the Ds, shaping the future of work. There's a ton of research under this. To be honest, we've been quite productive over the past year because it's a hot topic that we're dealing with. So those are just some of the white papers. I mentioned the Balanced Communication Diet for Business. We did publish some stuff right at the beginning of the pandemic about home working, because BT's been doing home working for a very long time. We've looked at those networks and how collaboration works remotely. And most of the stats that you saw were from Beyond the Office, which was the survey that we did of leaders and what they thought about remote working. So I'm going to stop talking now and stop sharing. And yeah, back over to you, John.
Thank you very much for that, Nicola. Really, really interesting presentation, and quite a few different bits and pieces resonated with me, as I'm sure it did with the others. I suppose the big bit that resonates with me is how rapid the change in technology has been, and to some extent we were prepared for that, but how unprepared we were for the impact on culture and on people and on behaviour. And to that end, brilliant to have Patrick joining us, People and Change Consulting partner for Grant Thornton across Ireland. So as I said at the start, Patrick probably doesn't need much introduction as previous chair of the Society himself, but he specialises in delivering behavioural change through capability building. And again, from previous discussions, I know that Patrick has and is seeing real behavioural impact on teams and individuals from working remotely, and believes that there is a need to think about properly addressing how organisations react to and manage this change in the working environment. So we already have a few questions and some very interesting questions. And just a reminder to all attendees, if you do want to submit a question, please do so via the Q&A function on Zoom. And if you want me to pose your question either to Nicola or Patrick, please indicate that in your question. Otherwise, I will pick who I feel is the most appropriate. But Patrick, maybe could I hand over to you and just ask you to say a few words, sort of your initial comments, reactions, observations on Nicola's presentation, and maybe particularly in an accounting role or for finance functions within businesses, what is the specific impact? Just over to you, Patrick, for some thoughts before we open up to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Nicola. That was fascinating, and I have heard you before, but every time it's different and things move very, very quickly. Yeah, I suppose reflecting on the days, I think for the accounting profession, first of all, John, it's the death of dinners for us, which depending on waistline and evenings and maybe committee members, that's probably a good thing. But I think in terms of reflecting what Nicola has said, I think we're in a perfect storm for change, and often for change to work, it needs to be transitional bit by bit. But I think over the last 10 months, there has been a sort of a sea change in the way organizations and individuals have had to cope with this. And actually, to be fair, most organizations and individuals have done really, really well. I think in terms of, we often look at this in terms of people, process, and technology. I think the processes and the technology have worked, and most organizations and their platforms have worked. I think where we are now is it's around, very much as Nicola was saying, around that people and culture bit, and organizations, as we're in the third lockdown, are now thinking about basically how they need to sort of address those cultural issues, address those people issues, and how that sort of office shape of the office, the structure of the workforce needs to look like going forward. And there are no easy answers. And I like Nicola's analogy about moving from an analog to a digital approach to leadership. And I think that is absolutely right. And there are no easy answers. And I think we've all been involved in those horrible hybrids where half the team might be in an office or at a client site. I suppose very briefly, John, in terms of the accounting profession, I think the accounting profession have coped really, really well. Audits, for example, people have removed very much to that remote working in terms of those in industry and the practitioners. I think one challenge that we're seeing and is that new trainees into the profession. What we're seeing is it's probably taken a lot more input to deliver the same output, and a lot of that training would have been on the job. And I think new graduates in, experienced hires, that's struggling a little bit. And then the research would suggest that often if you're a new employee or a graduate in particular, you're less likely to reach out for help. And I still think there's a big challenge around that, particularly with the number of trainees that we bring on into the accounting profession. But fascinating presentation and lots to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you. Well, as I say, we have quite a few questions coming in here. I had some questions of my own, but I wanted to make sure and get through the ones submitted by attendees. So I'm going to kick off maybe this first one to you, Nicola, and you talked about discussions around the future of the office. So this first question is, what advice would you give to organizations thinking at the moment about investing in new office accommodation in the short to medium term?
Yeah, I mean, offices are definitely not dead. Talking to some of the sort of property strategists over the past few months, I think their thinking has changed a bit as well. But if you look at companies like, say, the Googles and the Apples of the world, now, I went to Google, I went to their offices, certainly the ones in Dublin I've been around, and they're amazing offices. And actually Google, right up until the pandemic, didn't really encourage home working. And then, of course, they came out with this whole, oh, no, no one has to come back to the office ever again. Similarly, Apple, those amazing offices. Now, if you look at what both Google and Apple are doing, they are investing in new office spaces. So clearly, although they're saying, no, you don't have to go to the office anymore, they're actually recognizing that very good office facilities actually do make a difference. So it's very clear that what they're starting to do is to say we invest in very high quality because it's competing with home working now. And yes, we would probably like people to come into the office at least some of the time when they can, of course. So that I think the answer is, I think the top range offices are still going to be very competitively priced and quite in demand. There is quite a lot of talk around, well, if you don't want a permanent office, there may be a fair amount of property as a service type businesses coming along. And obviously you've got the WeWorks on one end of that spectrum, but there are a lot of other things that you can do around good quality property, but only when I need it. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of evolution in the actual property side, but I think the office is a very critical tool. If you can get people together, yes, for collaboration, but I do think it's that community and culture piece that it's very difficult to replicate digitally. So yeah, I think the prognosis is mixed. Certainly if you've got BT has a really interesting property portfolio, and most of the stuff that we're getting rid of at the moment very heavily are buildings that were built for kit, frankly. So most of the older BT buildings were built for very big racks of stuff. And they have no windows because racks of stuff don't need windows. People do, however. So if you look at what we're doing with our property strategy, we're actually investing in exactly that high quality property because we know actually we want property that enable people to work very productively together. And yes, it's going to compete with home as well. So yeah, it's an interesting area.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. Patrick, I'll come to you for this next question. It's very focused on sort of behavioural impact. So I'll just read it out. At work, we are split into two teams which rotate week on, week off, office, remote. the organization is in a customer-facing role and an essential service. The two teams have now become individual teams and seem to no longer see themselves as one. For example, they have separate WhatsApp groups and they share information within the group only that they're in, etc. So this question is coming in from a CEO, and he's asking, how does he or she overcome that challenge?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And I think building what Nicola has said, collaboration and team working and encouraging people to work in teams is difficult, particularly in a remote environment. But what we are seeing is that there is a move away. It's very much around distributed leadership. So teams are starting to form, but they're starting to work very, very effectively. But what I always say to teams, if you have dysfunctional teams, often people only look actually at what's happening within the team, but what you also need to do is look at how that team communicates with the other stakeholders and other teams. So I think it's around how you encourage team-to-team working. And I think there are ways of doing that in terms of maybe discussing it with the team, showing why it's important to interact so that they see the value in interacting with others. And I think digital allows you to do that. But yeah, this has happened actually a little bit in the last few months, where you have different groups coming in at different times, rotated, coming into the office. And it's one of the things around that culture. And it's maybe challenging why that has happened and why you're doing it that way. But that is one of the transitions we have to do. But it needs to be addressed, but in a constructive way.
Yeah. Super, thank you, Patrick. Nicola, I'll come to you on this next one, and in some ways it touches on the last question in terms of collaboration. And I love the way that this question is worded, so I'll just read it out to you. You talked in your presentation about the knowledge-based sectors and innovation being centered on the wisdom of crowds approach. This individual, their organization is reconfiguring their workspace to create that space for social interaction to support that. But the question is, how do we encourage staff to realize that and create that culture to support that rainforest of ideas, as the question asks?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because the work that we did specifically around collaboration showed that most people think it's a good idea and a good thing. Do they do it? No, not necessarily. Now, it doesn't happen by magic. So again, back to the leadership bit, a lot of what leaders need to do is to create the purpose for collaboration in the first place. There is a certain amount of the stuff around the leadership piece. I think some responsibility of leadership is to create the connections as well. Not all the responsibility, but I still say that we're moving from command and control leadership to connecting and collaboration. So creating that purpose and creating the good common ground. And that could be a digital common ground as well as a physical common ground, or it could be a combination, of course. And obviously sometimes my PhD was on motivation. So we're getting into interesting territory when we start talking about motivation, because I can geek out on this for hours. But the other thing that's interesting around particularly knowledge sharing and information sharing is if you introduce anything like competition in, that can destroy collaboration. It can also get a lot of ideas shared, but it can destroy people collaborating and cooperating. So whenever people start talking about gamifying some of this stuff, I start to get a little bit of that sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, because work isn't a game, and you have to think very carefully around some of the things around. Does it encourage or does it discourage sharing? You can also get people's attitudes to knowledge often also come back to, is it my knowledge or is it the group's knowledge? And again, sometimes back to how that's rewarded too. We tend to be quite an individualistic culture in both the US and the UK. Whereas if you look at Asia, they're more of a collectivist culture. So they're more likely to say that they share information for the common good. We're more likely to share information for individual gain. And again, the culture of an organization can dictate how strong that is as well. So there's a lot we need to think about. Yes, the spaces can be constructed to do it, but just co-locating people in a space does not necessarily mean that they collaborate. And also you've got to think about those spaces as well. There's some work that was done in MIT by a guy called Thomas Allen. He came up with this thing called the Allen curve, which was once you get about 10 meters apart, knowledge sharing starts to decline. And if you move people one floor away, they may as well be in Belgium, frankly. So, you know, there are some interesting dynamics around how on earth do we construct, if we're going to do a physical space, how do we actually construct it to encourage people to collaborate and put that culture in, and hopefully the measures in to help as well.
Very good. Brilliant. Thank you. I'm just thinking through here. There's a lot of themes in these questions coming up, and maybe what I might ask both Nicola, you and Patrick after the event, if there's any reference points that you have that would be useful links to send around to people for further reading on some of these topics, that might be really, really useful, because I'm conscious we're not going to cover all of the themes in the detail that they deserve over the next 5 minutes. But just sticking with you, Nicola, a question coming in here. You had talked about, you know, the old measure of productivity was in the industrial age, and, you know, what should the new measure of productivity be, particularly in a knowledge-based business? And one attendee has just asked here, how do you personally measure your own productivity?
We continuously have battles with that, because I think in the research and innovation space, it's very, very difficult, and particularly in innovation, failure is quite common. So if you say, oh, no, I'm going to measure, you know, my successes I've had, actually that can distort your figures, because you then don't learn from failure, or you end up becoming failure averse, which is very bad for an innovation team. So, I mean, research tend to do more around papers and patents in terms of measuring how good they are. I tend to, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I do, to be honest, it's around raising people's awareness of BT as an innovation, you know, brand. So we can do things like that. We can look at satisfaction scores and engagement scores from customers I've talked to. I also take a lot of feedback from people. So yeah, feedback from today's event, I will be putting to my boss to say they hated me. You know, they found it completely a waste of time. Please don't say that. But you know, that kind of thing. It is very, very difficult to measure, particularly since, you know, I don't sell anything either. So I can't say, hey, I sold X amount of network off the back of a conversation, because I probably won't. Well, we can initiate conversations with our account teams that might in a year's time initiate a sale. But yeah, it is very difficult. So yeah, I have the same problem. So if anyone's got any suggestions.
And I suspect, Nicola, you're speaking to a crowd of accountants who like the quantitative answers to measuring productivity. So the qualitative side is more difficult to get to grapple with. Patrick, I'm going to come to you for this next question, and it's probably one that I empathize a bit with. A lot of the research that Nicola referred to in her presentation, Patrick, was sort of post the first lockdown, whenever I suppose working from home was new and novel for people. And just attendee asking here, it'd be interesting to see how people feel now after this third lockdown, and I suppose some sense of, are people fed up working from home? Are they Zoom fatigued and they want to get back into the office? And just, Patrick, if you have seen any sort of sense of that, or what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The research, we would tend to look at New University Ireland Galway for research in Ireland, and it's interesting, between the first and second lockdown, the number of people wanting to work remotely increased actually by 10%, from around 78 to 88, around those numbers, very similar to the BT global research. I sense that may have changed a little bit in the third lockdown, and you sense that in terms of even the teaching profession and others. So I think there is that fatigue, and I think that sort of culture bit, the sort of the whole blending between work and home and the separation, and that's impacting resilience and mental health. And I think that is a challenge for people. If I could just plug one paper that was just published 2 weeks ago by the Irish government, and I think it's one of the few governments in Europe that have actually taken the lead in this, and they've published a national remote working strategy paper, catchy title called Making Remote Work. But a couple of things that they're saying in that, and it's worth, and I can send it to the guys, Karen, and we can circulate it. But one of the things that they're looking at is that you have to have, the Ireland are going to encourage the legal right to request remote work, but also a code of practice on the right to disconnect. And they're also looking at a whole thing around remote work hubs, which will impact office accommodation. And thirdly, they're looking at the whole tax legislation around the whole treatment of benefits. And that's going to be picked up in the budget. So there are things happening. And for those that are maybe looking for sort of thoughts as they reflect on their own organization, that policy paper is definitely worth a read. It's not too taxing, no pun intended.
Very good. Thank you very much. Folks, I'm conscious that the time on my computer has just hit 2 o'clock, so I'm going to try and wrap up. We didn't get quite all the answers done. There's one just around someone struggling with their team actually are more technologically advanced than they are, and how do they keep up, or how do they get up to speed fast? Again, look, maybe that's something where if you have references, we can include that and circulate that across to attendees. So we give ask you to give that some thought, and we'll try and go back out to attendees now. So look, can I, on behalf of all the attendees, thank Nicola and Patrick for a really thoughtful session. I think there's clearly some takeaways for each of us to think about within our own organizations. And on behalf of the Society, can I also thank all the attendees, 360 attendees registered for this afternoon's session. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your active participation. You have given me a tough job trying to keep on top of the questions coming in across the Q&A and the chat function, and that's the sign of a good session and a good seminar. So look, thanks Nicola, thanks Patrick, thanks everyone who has dialed in, and wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.